Have you ever noticed how people having a cigarette outside an office building will talk to complete strangers, connecting over nothing more than the shared act of smoking? Now imagine you're 19 years old, you haven't slept in 3 days, and the last familiar thing you remember doing is lighting a cigarette on your front porch back home. Private James Mitchell of the British Expeditionary Force sat in a waterlogged trench near Passchendaele in October 1917, his hands trembling not from cold but from 3 days without sleep around him. The Western Front stretched in an endless ribbon of mud and misery. The rats were as big as cats. The lice were inescapable. The smell of decomposition mixed with cordite and chlorine gas created an atmosphere that seemed designed to strip away everything that made a man human. But in his pocket, wrapped carefully in wax paper to keep them dry, were 6 Players Navy-cut cigarettes. To Mitchell and the men around him, these weren't just tobacco. They were proof that civilization still existed somewhere beyond the wire. They were a connection to home, to normalcy, to the person he used to be before the war taught him that human bodies could be transformed into pink mist by high explosives. The story of cigarettes in warfare is ultimately a story about how humans cope with the uncompiable, how they maintain their humanity in conditions designed to destroy it, and how a simple act of sharing smoke became one of the most powerful rituals of survival ever created. To understand why cigarettes became so vital to soldiers, we need to understand what war actually did to the human mind. Modern warfare, particularly the industrial slaughter of the world wars, created psychological conditions unprecedented in human history. Men lived for weeks or months in trenches where death could arrive, at any second, from artillery shells they couldn't see, gas attacks they couldn't predict, or snipers they couldn't identify. Dr. Thomas Salmon, chief psychiatric consultant to the American Expeditionary Force during World War I, documented what he called the systematic degradation of human cognition under sustained combat stress. His reports, initially classified to prevent damage to morale, revealed that soldiers weren't just scared. They were experiencing a fundamental breakdown in their ability to process reality as civilians understood it. The average infantryman on the Western Front experienced what we would now recognize as hypervigilance on a pathological scale. Every sound, every shadow, every unexpected movement triggered immediate fight or flight responses. The problem was that in trench warfare there was nowhere to fight and nowhere to flee. Men were trapped in a state of permanent psychological emergency, with no outlet for the massive amounts of stress hormones flooding their systems. Sleep became nearly impossible, not just because of the noise and danger, but because the brain refused to lower its guard. Soldiers would go days without real rest, catching minutes of unconsciousness between bombardments, always listening, always ready. The exhaustion compounded until men began experiencing hallucinations, seeing Germans climbing out of the walls, hearing whispered conversations in empty trenches. The degradation wasn't just mental. The physical conditions stripped away every comfort that humans take for granted. Corporal William Pressey of the Royal Fusiliers kept a diary throughout his service that survived the war. His entries from the Somme offensive describe an existence that barely qualified as living. Men stood ankle-deep in water, mixed with sewage and blood for days at a time, their feet rotting inside their boots from trench foot. They ate cold bully beef from tins, often sharing with rats that had grown bold enough to steal food from sleeping men. They defecated in buckets that couldn't be emptied during daylight hours because of sniper fire. Personal hygiene became impossible. Men went weeks without bathing. Lice infested every uniform, every blanket, every inch of cloth. Soldiers developed a routine called reading their shirts, picking lice from the seams and crushing them between their thumbnails. The lice carried diseases. The bites became infected. But there was no escape from them. In these conditions, soldiers faced what psychologists would later term existential annihilation, the systematic destruction of everything that gave their lives structure and meaning. They couldn't control when they ate, when they slept, when they lived or died. They watched friends transformed into corpses in front of them, sometimes so suddenly there wasn't even time to react. They lived surrounded by human remains they couldn't bury because no man's land belonged to the machine guns. The psychological response to these conditions was predictable. Men began to shut down emotionally. The 1,000-yard stare that would become famous in later wars started here, a dissociative state where soldiers simply stopped processing the horror around them. They moved mechanically, followed orders automatically, existed without really living. And this is where cigarettes entered the story. The first thing to understand about cigarettes in wartime is that they weren't originally part of military culture. Before World War I, smoking was common among working-class men, but considered somewhat vulgar by officers and middle-class society. Pipes and cigars were respectable. Cigarettes were associated with factory workers and immigrants, but cigarettes had advantages that became critical in warfare. They were portable, they were quick to smoke, they didn't require the ritual and equipment of a pipe. A soldier could light a cigarette, take a few quick drags and extinguish it if danger appeared. The same cigarette could be relit later. Try doing that with a cigar. More importantly, cigarettes were easy to mass-produce and ship. By 1914, mechanization had made cigarette manufacturing incredibly efficient. James Bonsack's cigarette rolling machine, perfected in the 1880s, could produce 120,000 cigarettes per day. Companies like W.D. and H.O. Wills in Britain and the American Tobacco Company could manufacture millions of cigarettes weekly. When war broke out, both governments and private organisations recognised that tobacco could serve a military purpose. The British Army began including cigarettes in soldier rations almost immediately. By 1915, every British soldier was entitled to a weekly tobacco ration, usually cigarettes or pipe tobacco. The YMCA and various charitable organisations sent millions more as gifts. The American military was slower to adopt official tobacco rations, but when the United States entered the war in 1917, General John Pershing famously cabled Washington with a request that became legendary in military history. His message listed the supplies necessary for the American Expeditionary Force to function effectively in France. After ammunition, food, and medical supplies, he added, "Tobacco is as indispensable as the daily ration. We must have thousands of tons of it without delay." The War Department responded by including cigarettes in every soldier's rations. By 1918, American soldiers were receiving a weekly allocation of tobacco products. As a matter of course, the cost was absorbed into the military budget as a necessary expense, like boots or rifles. But understanding why cigarettes were distributed is different from understanding why they mattered so profoundly to the men who received them. Private Robert Graves, who would survive the war to become a famous poet and memoirist, described his first cigarette in the trenches in terms that reveal what was really happening. It wasn't about nicotine addiction, though that certainly played a role. It was about reclaiming a moment of control in a world where soldiers controlled nothing. Lighting a cigarette required a sequence of deliberate actions: reaching into your pocket, extracting the cigarette, finding your matches, if you were lucky enough to have waterproof ones, cupping your hands against the wind, striking the match, drawing in the flame. These simple actions, performed thousands of times in civilian life without thought, became almost ceremonial in the trenches. Because in that moment, you were doing something by choice. You were engaging in a familiar ritual from peacetime. The muscle memory of lighting a cigarette connected you to the person you'd been before the war, before you'd seen things that couldn't be unseen, done things that couldn't be undone. The physiological effects reinforce this psychological break. Nicotine is a powerful stimulant that reaches the brain within seconds of inhalation. It triggers the release of dopamine, creating a brief sense of pleasure and relaxation. For exhausted, traumatized soldiers, this chemical relief was profound. It didn't fix anything, but it provided a few minutes where the crushing weight of war lifted slightly. The act of smoking also enforced a pause. You couldn't smoke and dig. You couldn't smoke and carry supplies. Smoking required you to stop, to sit or stand still, to do nothing but breathe and exist for a few minutes. In an environment where soldiers were constantly working, constantly alert, constantly moving, these enforced pauses became vital psychological breaks. Sergeant Harry Patch, who became the last surviving combat veteran of World War I before his death in 2009, spoke extensively in his final years about the role of cigarettes in trench life. He described how the morning cigarette, smoked in the pre-dawn darkness before stand to, when men manned the fire step expecting a German attack, became a ritual that bound units together. The men didn't talk much during these morning smokes. They stood in the grey light, watching their breath mix with tobacco smoke, listening to the same ritual happening in German trenches across no man's land. For those few minutes, they were just men having a smoke, not soldiers preparing to kill or be killed. This communal aspect of smoking became one of its most important functions. Sharing cigarettes created bonds between men who might otherwise have remained strangers. The soldier who gave his last cigarette to a mate who'd run out wasn't just being generous. He was affirming their shared humanity, acknowledging that they were in this together. Lieutenant Ernst Junger, a German officer whose memoir Storm of Steel became one of the definitive accounts of trench warfare, described watching his men share cigarettes after a particularly brutal bombardment. Several soldiers had been killed, others were wounded. The survivors sat in shell holes passing cigarettes back and forth, not speaking. Junger realized he was witnessing something profound, men using the simplest possible ritual to remind each other that they were still alive, still human, still capable of kindness even surrounded by industrial-scale cruelty. The sharing went beyond just giving cigarettes to comrades. One of the most remarkable aspects of cigarette culture in warfare was how it sometimes transcended the enemy lines. The Christmas truce of 1914 is famous for the football matches played in no man's land, but what's less discussed is how it started. In many sectors, it began with cigarettes German soldiers called out to British lines offering to trade tobacco. British soldiers responded. Men who'd been trying to kill each other hours earlier stood in the cratered wasteland between trenches, sharing smokes and showing pictures of their families. These truces didn't last, of course. Officers on both sides, horrified by the fraternization, cracked down hard. But the cigarette exchanges didn't entirely stop. Throughout the war, there were documented cases of soldiers throwing cigarettes across no man's land during quiet periods. The implicit message was clear. We're not like the generals and politicians who started this. We're just men stuck in hell, same as you. Captain Alexander Stewart of the Scottish Rifles recorded an incident from 1916 where a German soldier managed to communicate in broken English that they were out of tobacco. The British soldiers, after some debate, bundled some cigarettes into a sandbag and threw it across. The Germans responded by throwing back a bottle of schnapps. For the rest of that week, the two sides maintained an unofficial ceasefire in that sector. Nobody wanted to shoot the men they'd just traded with. These exchanges were officially discouraged and sometimes punished, but they continued because they served a vital psychological function. They allowed soldiers to maintain the belief that their enemies were human beings, not the monsters that propaganda portrayed. This was actually psychologically protective research on combat trauma, has shown that soldiers who can maintain some sense of their enemy's humanity cope better with the act of killing than those who completely dehumanize their opponents. The cigarette rituals extended beyond just smoking. Trading cigarettes became a universal currency in ways that military scrip or even money couldn't match. A cigarette could buy you a hot meal from a French farmhouse. It could get you first in line for the shower tent. It could convince a supply sergeant to overlook missing equipment. It could pay for a local woman to wash your uniform or a child to carry messages. Different cigarette brands had different values. British troops particularly prized Woodbines and Player's Navy Cut. American soldiers traded their Lucky Strikes, and Camel's German troops valued their own brands but would trade for anything when their supplies ran short. By 1917, an entire shadow economy had developed based on cigarette exchange rates between armies. But the value wasn't really about the tobacco. It was about what cigarettes represented, small portable pieces of civilization that could be exchanged, shared, gifted or traded to create human connections in an environment designed to destroy them. The importance of cigarettes became even more apparent in prisoner of war camps, where they literally became currency. British prisoners in German camps, American prisoners in Japanese camps, German prisoners in Allied camps all discovered that cigarettes were more valuable than money because cigarettes could actually buy things while currency was often worthless. The Red Cross, understanding this, made cigarettes a priority in their prisoner parcels. A prisoner who received cigarettes could trade them for extra food, warmer clothes, better sleeping positions, protection from camp bullies, or just the small comforts that made survival bearable. Prisoners who didn't smoke still treasured cigarettes because of their exchange value. Captain Patrick Reed, who escaped from Colditz Castle, described in his memoirs how cigarettes functioned as the de facto currency of the camp. Exchange rates were established between cigarettes and other goods. 5 cigarettes might buy you a chocolate bar from someone's Red Cross parcel. 20 cigarettes could get you a warmer coat. 50 cigarettes might convince a guard to look the other way at a crucial moment. The cigarette economy in POW camps became so sophisticated that it functioned almost like a real financial system, complete with banking, lending, and even inflation. Prisoners who received regular parcels with cigarettes could loan them out at interest. Men saved cigarettes for major purchases. The arrival of Red Cross parcels, often containing 200 cigarettes, functioned like payday, causing temporary economic booms in camp economies. What's psychologically fascinating about this is that the cigarette economy provided structure and purpose in an environment designed to break men's spirits through boredom and powerlessness, prisoners could plan, save, trade, and negotiate. These activities, trivial as they might seem, gave men reasons to think about the future and engage with the world around them. It kept their minds active and their spirits alive. The psychological power of cigarettes extended to the darkest moments of warfare. Soldiers universally reported offering cigarettes to wounded comrades, even when both men knew the wound was fatal. The dying man would accept the cigarette, take a few drags, and sometimes even thank his friend. Both men understood what was really happening, not a smoke break, but a final gesture of fellowship, a recognition of shared humanity at the threshold of death. Medics and stretcher bearers made sure to carry cigarettes specifically for this purpose. They understood that while they couldn't always save lives, they could make death slightly less lonely and terrifying by sharing that last smoke. Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, the Canadian doctor who wrote the famous poem In Flanders Fields, kept notes about his work in field hospitals. He recorded offering cigarettes to wounded soldiers, watching how the simple act of smoking calmed men who were in terrible pain or facing amputation. The cigarette didn't stop the pain, but it gave them something familiar to focus on, something normal in circumstances that were anything but. The ritual extended to military executions. Offering a condemned prisoner a last cigarette before execution became so universal that it appeared in military regulations and popular culture. The practice served multiple purposes. It gave the condemned man a moment of comfort before death. It acknowledged his humanity even as the military prepared to end his life. And it provided a final shared ritual between the prisoner and his executioners, a moment where both sides could briefly acknowledge the tragedy of the situation. Private Eddie Slovic, the only American soldier executed for desertion during World War II, was offered cigarettes before his execution by firing squad in January 1945. He smoked 2 of them while waiting, his hands shaking. The soldiers who formed the firing squad also smoked, unable to look at each other or at Slovic. After the execution, several members of the firing squad required psychological counselling. The shared cigarette before and after was a crucial part of how they processed what they'd been ordered to do. The psychological function of cigarettes became even more important during World War II, when the scale and intensity of combat increased dramatically. The introduction of truly mobile warfare, sustained aerial bombardment, and the island-hopping campaigns in the Pacific created new forms of combat stress. Soldiers in World War II fought longer campaigns with fewer breaks. The constant movement meant less opportunity for the informal rest periods that had sometimes occurred in the static trench warfare of World War I. The addition of air power meant that even rear areas weren't truly safe. Nobody was ever completely out of danger. Cigarette consumption skyrocketed. By 1944, the US military was purchasing and distributing over 34 billion cigarettes annually to troops. That's roughly 140 cigarettes per week for every serviceman. The cigarettes were considered so important that they received priority shipping, even when other supplies were delayed. Captain Paul Fussell, who served in the European theatre and later became a renowned cultural historian, analysed the role of cigarettes in his memoir of the war. He observed that smoking in World War II served an additional function beyond those in World War I. The faster pace of combat meant less time for traditional forms of stress relief. Soldiers couldn't always write letters, organise games, or engage in other recreational activities, but they could always smoke. Smoking became the universal break. 5 minutes between movements, a cigarette. 10 minutes before the next patrol, a cigarette. Waiting for orders in a bombed-out building, a cigarette. The act of smoking marked time and created structure in days that otherwise blurred together into an endless sequence of danger and exhaustion. The Pacific Theatre presented unique challenges that made cigarettes even more valued. The heat and humidity of jungle warfare made everything difficult. Men fought in conditions where their uniforms rotted, their boots disintegrated, and fungal infections covered their bodies. Malaria, dysentery, and a dozen other tropical diseases killed almost as many men as combat. In these conditions, cigarettes represented one of the few things that remained consistent and reliable. A cigarette tasted the same whether you were in basic training in California or hiding in a foxhole on Guadalcanal. The ritual of smoking provided continuity and normalcy when nothing else did. Marine Corpsman Eugene Sledge, whose memoir With the Old Breed became one of the definitive accounts of Pacific combat, described how cigarettes functioned as social lubricant among Marines who'd become almost feral from sustained combat. Men who couldn't talk about what they'd seen and done could share a smoke and communicate something wordless about their shared experience. The cigarette became a language when words failed. The stress of island warfare was particularly intense because there were no rear areas, no safe zones. The Japanese defense in-depth strategy meant that soldiers could be attacked at any time from any direction. Men slept in their foxholes with their weapons, never knowing if they'd wake up to find infiltrators in their positions. The psychological strain was enormous. Sledge recorded that some Marines chain-smoked entire packs during bad nights, the constant smoking providing both a way to stay alert and a method of burning through nervous energy that otherwise had no outlet. The glow of cigarettes in foxholes became a kind of communication system, men signalling to each other that they were awake, they were watching, they weren't alone. The introduction of cigarettes specifically designed for military use showed how seriously the armed forces took their psychological value. The K-ration, the standard field ration for American troops, included a pack of 4 cigarettes as standard. These weren't civilian brands, they were specially packaged military cigarettes in moisture-resistant packaging, often in small flat tins that would survive combat conditions. Different nations provided different brands. British troops received Woodbines or Players. Canadian soldiers got Sweet Caporals. Soviet soldiers received Kazbek or Belomorkanel. Often in simplified packaging to save resources, German soldiers received Juno or Eckstein, though supplies became sporadic as Germany's industrial capacity collapsed. The fact that every nation, regardless of their economic situation or military philosophy, prioritized cigarette production and distribution speaks to how universal the need was recognized to be. Cigarettes weren't a luxury. They were a psychological necessity that helped keep armies functional. American tobacco companies actively promoted their cigarettes as patriotic necessities. Lucky Strike famously changed their packaging from green to white, claiming the green dye was needed for the war effort, while simultaneously using the slogan, "Lucky Strike Green has gone to war." Camel cigarettes were advertised with images of soldiers smoking in combat zones. The tobacco companies understood that associating their brands with military service would create lifelong customers among returning veterans. But beyond the corporate cynicism, there was a genuine recognition among military planners that cigarettes served a vital function in maintaining morale and combat effectiveness. Studies conducted by military psychologists during the war confirmed that soldiers who smoked handled stress better, maintained unit cohesion more effectively, and showed lower rates of psychiatric breakdown than non-smokers. Now we understand these studies were complicated by selection bias, and the universal availability of cigarettes making it hard to find control groups. But the universal belief among soldiers themselves was clear. Cigarettes helped them cope. Whether that was physiological from the nicotine, psychological from the ritual, or social from the sharing didn't matter. The effect was real. The post-combat cigarette became one of the most iconic images of warfare. Photographs from every conflict show exhausted soldiers sitting in rubble or jungle clearings smoking. These images resonated because they captured something true about combat, the moment when the immediate danger passed and men could briefly return to themselves, could acknowledge that they were still alive, still human. Photographer Robert Capa, who covered 5 wars and captured some of the most famous combat images ever taken, deliberately photographed soldiers smoking. He understood that these moments revealed the human cost of war more effectively than images of combat itself. The exhaustion, relief, grief, and determination in a soldier's face as he lit a cigarette said everything about the experience of warfare. The Korean War saw the continuation of cigarette culture despite growing evidence about health dangers. By the early 1950s, medical research had begun establishing links between smoking and lung cancer, but this information barely penetrated military culture. Cigarettes remained in rations, smoking remained universal among troops. The Korean winter added another dimension to cigarette culture. In temperatures that dropped to -40 degrees, where frostbite could disable a man in minutes, and equipment froze solid, cigarettes became even more psychologically important. The brief warmth from smoking, the few seconds of heat from the burning tobacco became intensely meaningful. Private James Brady, who fought at the Chosin Reservoir in conditions that would become legendary for their brutality, described how Marines shared cigarettes in the frozen night, passing them along the line of foxholes because men's hands were too frozen to light their own. The sharing wasn't just about nicotine. It was proof that civilization hadn't completely abandoned them to die in the Korean mountains. The Chinese forces they fought against had their own cigarette culture. Captured Chinese soldiers carried cheaper brands. Often loose tobacco and rice paper for rolling their own American troops learned to recognize the smell of Chinese cigarettes, different from American tobacco, as a warning that enemy forces were nearby. the cigarette exchanges that had happened in World War I occasionally recurred in Korea. During the static warfare of 1951 to 1953, when the battle lines stabilized into trench warfare reminiscent of World War I, there are documented cases of American and Chinese soldiers throwing cigarettes across the lines during quiet periods. Military police tried to stop these exchanges, but the need for human connection transcended official policy. Vietnam marked the beginning of the end for cigarettes as universal military culture, though their use remained widespread. The arrival of marijuana in the combat zone provided an alternative form of smoking that many soldiers preferred. Marijuana's dissociative effects were more appealing to some troops than nicotine stimulation, particularly for soldiers dealing with the surreal nature of guerrilla warfare. But cigarettes remained dominant, and their function evolved. Vietnam was the first war covered extensively by television cameras and photojournalists who could move freely with combat units. The image of soldiers smoking became one of the defining visual elements of war coverage, signalling to viewers that these were ordinary young men in extraordinary circumstances. The psychological stress of Vietnam was different from previous wars. The lack of clear front lines meant soldiers could never truly relax. The guerrilla nature of the fighting meant that anyone might be the enemy. The controversial nature of the war meant that soldiers returned home to hostility rather than heroes' welcomes. These factors created new forms of combat trauma. Cigarettes provided continuity in a war defined by discontinuity. A soldier could go from intense combat to standing in a bar in Saigon to sleeping in his base camp bunk, all in the same day. The cigarette ritual remained constant across these jarring transitions, providing psychological anchoring when nothing else made sense. Marine Lieutenant Phil Caputo, whose memoir A Rumour of War became one of the most important Vietnam narratives, described lighting cigarettes after firefights as a way to confirm that he'd survived. The simple act of lighting up, the muscle memory of the gesture, brought him back from the dissociative state that combat created. The cigarette told his body and mind that the immediate danger had passed, that he could stop existing in pure fight-or-flight mode. The sharing of cigarettes with Vietnamese civilians became a complex gesture, laden with political and psychological meaning. American soldiers would give cigarettes to children, village elders, or suspected Viet Cong prisoners. The act served multiple purposes. It was a gesture of goodwill, an attempt to win hearts and minds. It was a way to humanize people who might otherwise be seen only as the enemy, and it was a method of creating obligation and building intelligence networks. But for the soldiers themselves, sharing cigarettes with Vietnamese people often represented an attempt to maintain their own humanity. If they could be generous, if they could share something valuable with people they'd been trained to see as other, then maybe they weren't becoming the monsters that guerrilla warfare threatened to create. The myth of the cigarette's power in warfare was so strong that it survived even as medical evidence mounted about smoking's dangers. By the 1970s, the link between smoking and lung cancer was definitively established. Public health campaigns in civilian society began reducing smoking rates, but military smoking rates remained stubbornly high. The military began removing cigarettes from rations in the 1970s and 1980s, but this didn't significantly reduce smoking among troops. Soldiers simply purchased their own cigarettes or received them in care packages. The ritual was too deeply embedded in military culture to be eliminated by policy changes. The first Gulf War in 1991 saw high smoking rates among coalition forces despite official discouragement. Soldiers waiting in the Saudi desert for months before the ground offensive chain smoked through their boredom and anxiety. When combat finally came, the intensity and short duration meant cigarettes served their traditional function of marking the transition back to relative safety. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that began in 2001 have shown that cigarette culture persists even as smoking has become increasingly stigmatized in civilian society. Modern soldiers face stresses that earlier generations would recognize. The constant threat of IEDs creates hypervigilance similar to what trench soldiers experienced with artillery. The extended deployments with brief home leave create jarring psychological transitions. The nature of counterinsurgency warfare, where anyone might be the enemy, creates profound distrust and isolation. Cigarettes continue to serve as psychological anchors in these conditions. A 2012 study found that smoking rates among deployed troops were more than double the rates among non-deployed military personnel. Soldiers who experienced combat were significantly more likely to smoke than those in support roles. The correlation between stress and smoking remained as strong as it had been in World War I. The sharing ritual persists too. Soldiers report offering cigarettes to local nationals during patrols, using tobacco as a bridge across language and cultural barriers. Iraqi and Afghan men, in cultures where smoking is common among males, recognize the gesture's meaning. A shared cigarette becomes a moment of common humanity in interactions otherwise defined by suspicion and danger. The modern military has tried to address smoking through health education and smoking cessation programs, but with limited success in combat zones. Commanders understand the contradiction between anti-smoking policies and the reality that soldiers use cigarettes to manage stress that would otherwise manifest in more destructive ways. Smoking rates always increase during deployments and decrease when soldiers return home, suggesting that the tobacco use is a coping mechanism specific to combat stress. The transition away from cigarettes as a central element of military culture is happening, but slowly. Younger soldiers grow up in a society where smoking is increasingly rare and stigmatized. Alternative stress relief methods, including better mental health support and recognition of PTSD, provide other options. But the ritual power of sharing a cigarette after surviving something terrible remains potent. Veterans from every conflict describe the memory of particular cigarettes with a clarity that exceeds their memory of combat itself. The cigarette shared with a friend who died the next day. The cigarette smoked while sitting on a disabled tank waiting for rescue. The cigarette that a Vietnamese woman gave them in gratitude for some small kindness. The cigarette that tasted like survival. These memories persist because the cigarettes weren't really about tobacco. They were about the assertion of humanity in inhuman conditions, about creating moments of normalcy in abnormal circumstances, about building connections between people who shared something that couldn't be explained to those who hadn't experienced it. The cigarette in warfare functioned as a tool for psychological survival as important as the rifle or rations. It gave soldiers a way to mark time, to transition between mental states, to connect with comrades, and to maintain the sense that they were still people and not just instruments of violence. When Private James Mitchell, who we met sitting in that waterlogged trench in 1917, finally made it home to Manchester in 1919, he continued smoking for the rest of his life. His daughter, interviewed for an oral history project in the 1980s, asked him once why he'd never quit despite the health warnings. His answer was simple. "Every cigarette reminds me that I made it home when so many others didn't. It's my way of staying connected to the men I served with, the ones who aren't here to smoke anymore." This sentiment, repeated by veterans across generations, reveals the ultimate truth about cigarettes in warfare. They were never just tobacco. They were a ritual of remembrance, a connection to fallen comrades, a way of honouring shared experience that civilians couldn't understand. The cigarette became the currency of humanity in war because it represented everything that war tried to destroy. The choice to smoke was a choice when soldiers had no others. The moment of peace while smoking was a respite from constant danger. The sharing of cigarettes was kindness in a context of cruelty. The ritual of lighting up was proof that civilization survived even in the trenches. German soldiers laughed at American fighters in 1943 until those fighters' guns taught them fear. But German and American soldiers alike understood the meaning of sharing a cigarette across a crater, of offering tobacco to a wounded enemy, of lighting up after surviving another day in hell. The smoke that rose from trenches, foxholes, and forward operating bases across a century of warfare carried with it the prayers, hopes, and memories of men who had nothing left but each other and the simple human act of sharing fire. In the end, it wasn't about nicotine addiction or corporate marketing or military policy. It was about how humans cope with trauma by creating rituals that affirm life in the face of death. The cigarette was just paper and tobacco, but what it represented was infinitely more valuable. It was proof that you could stand in the middle of mechanized slaughter, designed to reduce humans to statistics and still find a way to feel human again, if only for the few minutes it took to smoke. That's why soldiers shared cigarettes across enemy lines, why they gave their last smoke to dying friends, why they remembered specific cigarettes decades later with perfect clarity. It wasn't about the tobacco. It was about the desperate, persistent, beautiful human need to connect, to care, to share something good, even when surrounded by everything bad. The thunder of artillery could be heard for miles. The roar of aircraft engines shook the ground. The crack of rifles marked the rhythm of battle. But in the brief silences between the violence, another sound persisted. The scratch of a match, the soft crackle of burning tobacco, the exhale of smoke into the air, the sound of humans refusing to stop being human, no matter what the war demanded.